If you walk through the grand boulevards of Paris today, past the Arc de Triomphe and the gilded gates of the Élysée Palace, you will see monuments to the glory of the French Republic. You will see statues of revolutionary heroes who fought for liberty, equality, and fraternity. The story France tells itself is a beautiful one. It is the story of a nation that brought civilization to the world, that fought against tyranny, and that granted independence to its colonies with grace and generosity. The French Republic prides itself on being the birthplace of human rights, the champion of the Enlightenment, the nation that abolished slavery and embraced freedom. But there is a different version of this story. It is a version that you will not find in the museums of the Louvre or the classrooms of the Sorbonne. It is a version that is whispered with anger in the markets of Dakar and the streets of Abidjan. In this version of the story, France never actually left Africa. The flags came down and the governors went home, but the colonial system simply changed its uniform. It put on a suit and tie, opened a bank account, and continued the extraction. This version tells of a financial mechanism so elegant and so ruthless that it makes the British sterling trap look amateurish by comparison. This is the story of the CFA franc. It is the story of how France designed a currency system that has kept 14 African nations in a state of permanent economic servitude for over 75 years. It is the story of how a former colonial power continues to extract billions of dollars from some of the poorest countries on earth, while maintaining the fiction of independence and partnership. It challenges every claim France has ever made about its commitment to African development and reveals the cold mathematical truth that colonialism never ended. It just became more sophisticated. To understand this theft, we have to go back to the moment when the French Empire was dying but refused to accept its own death. In 1945, France emerged from the Second World War as a defeated and humiliated nation. The Germans had occupied Paris. The Vichy government had collaborated with the Nazis. The resistance had fought bravely, but the truth was undeniable. France had been saved not by its own strength, but by American soldiers and British bombers. The French economy was in ruins. The industrial base was destroyed. The currency, the French franc, was collapsing under the weight of inflation, but France still had one source of wealth. It had an empire. Across West and Central Africa, the French tricolor still flew over vast territories. These were colonies that produced cocoa, coffee, cotton, uranium, gold, and oil. They were home to millions of people who had fought for France in both world wars, who had bled in the trenches of Verdun and died on the beaches of Normandy wearing French uniforms. These African soldiers had been promised that their sacrifice would be rewarded with freedom and equality. They believed the rhetoric of liberty that France preached. They were betrayed. In 1945, the French government faced a crisis. The colonies were demanding independence. Nationalist movements were rising across Africa. Leaders like Félix Houphouët-Boigny in Ivory Coast, Léopold Sédar Senghor in Senegal, and Sékou Touré in Guinea were organizing mass movements. They wanted self-determination. They wanted to control their own resources. They wanted to build their own nations. France knew that it could not hold the colonies by force forever. The age of direct colonial rule was ending. The United Nations was passing resolutions condemning colonialism. The world was watching, so France invented a new form of control. If they could not own the land, they would own the money. In 1945, the French treasury created a new currency called the CFA franc. The letters CFA originally stood for Colonies Françaises d'Afrique, French colonies of Africa. Later, after independence, the name would be sanitized to Communauté Financière Africaine, African Financial Community. But the acronym remained the same, and more importantly, the system remained identical. The CFA franc was not a currency created by Africans for Africans. It was a currency created by France for France. The rules of the CFA system were designed with surgical precision to ensure that France would maintain total financial control over its former colonies. There are actually two CFA francs. One is used by the West African Economic and Monetary Union, which includes 8 countries: Benin, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. The other is used by the Central African Economic and Monetary Community, which includes 6 countries: Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. These 14 nations have a combined population of over 180 million people. That is more than twice the population of Germany. The architecture of the CFA system rests on 4 pillars, and each one is a chain. The first pillar is the fixed exchange rate. The CFA franc is pegged to the euro at a fixed rate. Before 1999, it was pegged to the French franc. This means that the value of the CFA does not float freely based on the strength of the African economies. It is locked to the strength of the French economy. On the surface, this sounds like stability. France argued that by tying the CFA to a strong European currency, they were protecting African nations from inflation and currency volatility. But the reality is far more sinister. When your currency is pegged to a foreign economy, you lose the ability to control your own monetary policy. You cannot devalue your currency to make your exports more competitive. You cannot print money to invest in infrastructure during a crisis. You are trapped. If the euro is strong because the German economy is booming, then the CFA is also strong. But a strong currency is devastating for poor agricultural economies. It makes African exports, cocoa, coffee, cotton, impossibly expensive on the global market. African farmers cannot compete with farmers in Brazil or Vietnam because their currency is overvalued. Meanwhile, European goods become artificially cheap. French products flood into African markets, destroying local industries. The second pillar is the reserves requirement. This is where the theft becomes mathematical. Every country that uses the CFA franc is required to deposit 50% of its foreign exchange reserves into an account at the French Treasury in Paris. Let me repeat that. Half of the national savings of 14 African countries must be held in a bank in France. The account is called the operations account. It is controlled by the French Ministry of Finance. The African nations have no say in how this money is invested. They cannot withdraw it freely. They have to ask permission from the French Treasury. This is not a partnership. This is a hostage situation. Imagine if the United States told Mexico that it had to keep half of its gold reserves in a vault in Washington and needed American approval to access it. Imagine if China told Vietnam that 50% of its national savings had to be deposited in Beijing. The world would call it imperialism. But when France does it to 14 African nations, it is called monetary cooperation. The amount of African wealth sitting in Paris is staggering. Economists estimate that at any given time, there is between $10 and $20 billion of African reserves locked in the French treasury. That money is not sitting idle. France invests it. France uses it to buy French bonds, to stabilize the euro, to fund French infrastructure projects. And what do the African nations get in return? They get an interest rate of less than 1%. That is below the rate of inflation. This means the real value of their money is shrinking every year. France is using African capital to grow the French economy while Africa remains starved of investment. The third pillar is the monetary policy control. The central banks of the CFA zones are not truly independent. Yes, they have African governors and African staff, but the real power lies in the hands of French officials. France has guaranteed representation on the boards of both CFA central banks. French officials have veto power over major policy decisions. This means that if an African nation wants to change interest rates, to issue bonds, or to implement economic reforms, they need French approval. It is colonialism with a board of directors. The fourth pillar is the unlimited convertibility guarantee. This is the sugar that makes the poison go down. France promises that it will always back the CFA franc. If there is a run on the currency, if investors panic, France will step in with euros to maintain the peg. France presents this as an act of generosity, proof that they care about African stability. But this guarantee is not charity. It is a leash. Because of this guarantee, African nations are terrified to leave the CFA system. They have been told for decades that without French backing, their currencies would collapse. They have been told that independence would mean economic ruin. It is the logic of an abusive relationship. You cannot leave me because you will not survive without me. The consequences of the CFA system on the ground in Africa have been catastrophic. These 14 nations are among the poorest in the world despite being rich in natural resources. Ivory Coast is the world's largest producer of cocoa. Chocolate is a $100 billion industry, but the average cocoa farmer in Ivory Coast earns less than $1 per day. Why? Because they are forced to sell their beans in CFA francs, which are overvalued, and then buy imported goods in the same overvalued currency. The profit is extracted at every stage. French companies buy the cocoa cheap, process it in Europe, and sell the finished chocolate back to Africa at a premium. Niger is one of the largest producers of uranium in the world. French nuclear power plants run on uranium mined from the deserts of Niger. France generates 70% of its electricity from nuclear power. The lights of Paris are powered by uranium that glows in the reactors of EDF, Électricité de France. But Niger is one of the poorest nations on Earth. It ranks last on the UN Human Development Index. The people who live above some of the richest uranium deposits in the world do not have electricity. The French company Orano, formerly Areva, has been mining uranium in Niger since 1971. For decades, Niger sold its uranium to France at prices far below the global market rate. It was not a negotiation. It was a tribute. The revenue that should have built schools and hospitals in Niger was instead used to keep the air conditioning running in French shopping malls. Gabon is one of the richest countries in Africa in terms of GDP per capita because of its oil. But 30% of the population lives in poverty. The oil wealth is concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite, many of whom are French expatriates or local leaders who have been bought off by Paris. When Omar Bongo ruled Gabon for 42 years, he was one of the wealthiest men in Africa. He owned mansions in Paris and a fleet of luxury cars. When he died in 2009, his son Ali Bongo took over in an election widely considered fraudulent. France supported him. Why? Because the Bongo family ensured that French companies Total, Moral and Prom kept their monopoly on Gabonese oil. It was a dictatorship underwritten by the CFA system. As long as the oil revenues flowed to Paris, France did not care about democracy or human rights. The CFA system also prevents African nations from trading with each other. Because all 14 nations use the same currency and all their reserves are held in Paris, they are incentivized to trade with France and Europe rather than with their neighbors. Senegal and Ivory Coast are both in the CFA zone. They are 500 miles apart. But if a Senegalese company wants to buy goods from Ivory Coast, the transaction has to be cleared through the French treasury in Paris, thousands of miles away. It is financial insanity. It is a system designed to keep African economies dependent on Europe and disconnected from each other. It prevents the formation of a unified African market. It keeps the continent divided and weak. The intellectual architects of the CFA system were not fools. They were economists and central bankers who understood exactly what they were building. After World War II, the French treasury was led by men like Jacques Rueff and Maurice Couve de Merville. These were brilliant technocrats who had studied the British sterling system and learned its lessons. They realized that direct colonial rule was expensive and politically untenable. But financial colonialism was cheap and invisible. You did not need soldiers. You just needed a printing press and a good banker. The genius of the CFA was that it allowed France to extract wealth without the mess of military occupation. When African nations began demanding independence in the 1950s and 60s, France offered them a deal. You can have your flag and your national anthem, but you must keep the CFA franc. If you accept the currency, France will provide financial support, military protection, and access to French markets. If you refuse, you are on your own. Most African leaders accepted. They were told that the CFA would bring stability and development. They were told that France was a partner, not a master. But there was one man who saw through the lie. His name was Ahmed Sékou Touré, and he was the leader of Guinea. In 1958, French President Charles de Gaulle traveled to Guinea to oversee a referendum on independence. He expected the Guineans to vote yes to remaining part of the French community. He expected them to accept the CFA system like the other colonies. But Sékou Touré stood in front of de Gaulle and said, "We prefer poverty in freedom to riches in slavery." The Guineans voted overwhelmingly for complete independence. They rejected the CFA franc. They rejected French control. De Gaulle was furious. Within weeks, France enacted what can only be described as economic warfare. French officials left Guinea overnight, but before they left, they destroyed everything they could. They burned government records. They poured cement into the sewage systems. They smashed medical equipment in hospitals. They took every piece of infrastructure that France had built and rendered it useless. French companies pulled out. French banks froze Guinean assets. France launched a covert operation to destabilize the new government. They supported rebel groups. They flooded the country with counterfeit Guinean currency to cause hyperinflation. They used every tool of sabotage to punish Guinea for daring to be truly free. The message was clear. If you leave the CFA system, France will destroy you. The lesson was learned by every other African leader. No one else tried to leave. For decades, Guinea struggled in isolation. The economy collapsed. Sékou Touré became increasingly authoritarian, paranoid that France was trying to overthrow him. And he was right. French intelligence agencies were working with opposition groups to destabilize the regime. Guinea became a cautionary tale. Look what happens when you defy France. Look what happens when you choose real independence. But the story of the CFA did not end with Guinea. In the 1980s and 90s, as globalization spread and the world became more interconnected, the injustice of the CFA system became harder to hide. African economists, intellectuals, and activists began to speak out. They called the CFA a colonial relic, a tool of exploitation. One of the most vocal critics was Sylvanus Olympio, the first president of Togo. Olympio was a trained economist who understood monetary policy. He saw that the CFA was draining wealth from his country. He began to quietly plan to leave the system and create an independent Togolese currency. He reached out to other African leaders to build a coalition. He wanted to create a West African currency that would be controlled by Africans for Africans. On January 13, 1963, just 3 days before he was set to announce his currency reform, Sylvanus Olympio was assassinated. He was shot dead outside the American embassy in Lomé by a group of soldiers. The leader of the assassination squad was a man named Etienne Iadema, a former sergeant in the French colonial army. Iadema had been trained by the French military. After the assassination, Iadema seized power in a coup. He ruled Togo as a brutal dictator for 38 years, and he kept Togo in the CFA system. France recognized his government immediately. French troops were stationed in Togo to protect the new regime. It is widely believed that French intelligence was involved in the assassination. France has never admitted it. But the pattern is clear. Leaders who threaten the CFA system do not live long. The same pattern repeated in other countries. In 1987, Burkina Faso was led by Thomas Sankara, a revolutionary leader who was beloved by his people. Sankara was a Pan-Africanist who believed in self-reliance and African unity. He implemented radical reforms. He vaccinated millions of children. He planted millions of trees to fight desertification. He promoted women's rights and banned female genital mutilation. He changed the name of his country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, which means land of upright people. Sankara was not corrupt. He drove a humble car and lived in a small house. He was everything a leader should be, but Sankara also spoke out against the CFA Franc. He called it a tool of imperialism. He argued that African nations should refuse to pay their debts to France and the IMF. He said that the debt was illegitimate, that it was a mechanism to keep Africa poor. He was building a coalition of African leaders to challenge the system. On October 15, 1987, Thomas Sankara was assassinated in a coup led by his former friend Blaise Compaoré. Sankara was shot 12 times. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. Compaoré took power and immediately reversed Sankara's policies. He embraced the CFA system. He opened Burkina Faso to French corporations. He became a loyal ally of Paris. France supported him for 27 years until he was finally overthrown in a popular uprising in 2014. The murder of Thomas Sankara is a wound that has never healed in Africa. He is remembered as a martyr, a man who died because he dared to imagine a free Africa. The financial mechanics of the CFA system also create a cycle of debt and dependency. Because African nations are forced to hold their reserves in France, they have less capital to invest in their own development. When they need to build infrastructure, roads, schools, hospitals, they have to borrow money. And who do they borrow from? France. The French Development Agency, Agence Française de Développement, provides loans to CFA countries. These loans come with conditions. The African nation must hire French companies to do the construction. They must buy French equipment. The money never actually leaves France. It is just a bookkeeping entry. France lends money to Africa, and then African nations pay French companies with that money. It is a closed loop that enriches French corporations while burying African nations in debt. The debt burden of CFA nations is staggering. Countries like Niger, Chad, and the Central African Republic spend more on debt service than they spend on healthcare or education. They are trapped in a cycle where they borrow to survive, and then they owe so much that they have to borrow more just to pay the interest. And where does the money to pay the debt come from? From the export of raw materials to France. The cocoa, the uranium, the oil, it all flows north. The wealth of Africa is extracted, and the debt ensures that the extraction continues forever. It is a modern form of slavery, not of bodies, but of nations. In recent years, the anger has been building. A new generation of Africans, young people who were born after independence, who never knew colonial rule, are asking hard questions. They are connected to the world through the internet. They can see that other former colonies in Asia and Latin America have developed, while Africa remains poor. They are looking for explanations, and they are finding the CFA Franc. Activists like Kemi Seba, a Franco-Beninese firebrand, have led protests across West Africa, burning CFA banknotes in the streets. They call the currency colonial money and demand its abolition. Their slogan is simple: France, get out of Africa. The French government has responded with a mixture of denial and cosmetic reform. In 2019, French President Emmanuel Macron announced changes to the CFA system for West Africa. He said that the name would be changed from CFA Franc to ECO. He said that France would no longer require the 50% reserves to be held in Paris. He said that French representatives would leave the board of the central bank. It was presented as a historic reform, proof that France was listening to African concerns. But when you read the fine print, the changes are superficial. The currency is still pegged to the euro. The convertibility guarantee is still in place. France still has veto power over major decisions through indirect mechanisms. The ECO has not even been launched. It was supposed to be introduced in 2020, but it has been delayed indefinitely. The reform was a public relations exercise, not a real change. And the reserves requirement, while officially removed, has been replaced by an understanding that CFA nations will still keep significant reserves in euros, which means keeping them in European banks, which means keeping them accessible to France. The chains have been polished, but they have not been broken. The central truth remains: France still controls the money supply of 14 African nations. France still profits from African poverty. The flow of wealth still runs from south to north, from black to white, from the colonized to the colonizer. The total amount of wealth that France has extracted from Africa through the CFA system is incalculable. We are not just talking about the reserves held in Paris. We are talking about the undervaluation of African exports, the overvaluation of African imports, the interest on the debt, the profits of French corporations, the uranium that powers French cities, the cocoa that fills French chocolates, the oil that fuels French cars. If you could add it all up, the number would be in the trillions of dollars. It would be a transfer of wealth so large that it would dwarf the Marshall Plan. It would make the British looting of India look small by comparison. France is one of the wealthiest nations in the world. It has the 7th largest economy on Earth. It is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. It is a nuclear power. It has universal healthcare, free education, and a high standard of living. Where did that wealth come from? The French will tell you it came from hard work, innovation, and democracy. But the uncomfortable truth is that a significant portion of that wealth came from Africa. It came from the cocoa fields of Ivory Coast and the uranium mines of Niger. It came from the oil rigs of Gabon and the cotton plantations of Burkina Faso. It came from a monetary system that was designed to extract and transfer. France rebuilt its economy after World War II not just with American aid, but with African resources. The gleaming towers of La Défense, the high-speed trains of the TGV, the nuclear reactors that keep the lights on, all of it is built on the foundation of the CFA franc. The legacy of the CFA is still shaping the world we live in today. It explains why West and Central Africa remain the poorest regions on Earth despite vast natural resources. It explains why African economies are dependent on the export of raw materials rather than producing finished goods. It explains why there is so little intra-African trade. It explains why African nations cannot invest in their own development. It explains why millions of young Africans risk their lives every year trying to cross the Mediterranean to reach Europe. They are not fleeing poverty. They are fleeing a system that was designed to keep them poor. The CFA franc also reveals the hypocrisy of the European Union's development policy. Europe spends billions of euros every year on aid to Africa. They present themselves as partners in development, as countries that care about lifting Africa out of poverty. But at the same time, the French government is running a monetary system that extracts far more wealth from Africa than Europe ever gives back in aid. It is like a man who steals your wallet and then gives you a coin and expects you to thank him for his generosity. The aid is a smokescreen. It is designed to hide the theft. The story of the CFA franc also teaches us a broader lesson about the nature of power in the modern world. Colonialism did not end when the flags came down. It simply evolved. The empires realized that you do not need to occupy a country to control it. You do not need governors and soldiers. You just need to control the money. If you control the currency, you control the economy. If you control the economy, you control the government. And if you control the government, you control the people. The CFA franc is the perfection of this logic. It is imperialism without the bad optics. It is exploitation with a French accent and a smile. There are signs that the system is finally beginning to crack. In 2017, the government of Mali, frustrated by decades of economic stagnation, began to explore alternatives to the CFA. In 2019, Italy accused France of impoverishing Africa through the CFA and called for European sanctions against the monetary system. The Italian government said openly what everyone in Africa already knew. France is still a colonial power. The backlash was fierce. France recalled its ambassador from Rome. The European Union closed ranks around France, but the fact that a European government was willing to say it out loud was a sign that the silence was breaking. In 2021, the military junta that seized power in Mali announced that it was considering leaving the CFA franc and creating a national currency. The French government responded with threats. French companies began to pull out of Mali. French military support was withdrawn, but the junta did not back down. They said that Mali's sovereignty was more important than French money. The standoff is ongoing, and the world is watching. If Mali successfully leaves the CFA and survives, it could inspire other nations to follow. The system that has lasted for 75 years could finally collapse. But we should not be naive. France will not let go easily. The CFA Franc is not just an economic system. It is the foundation of French influence in Africa. It is the reason that France is still treated as a global power. Without the CFA, without access to African resources, France would be just another mid-sized European nation. The CFA is what allows France to punch above its weight on the world stage. That is why France has fought so hard to preserve it. That is why French intelligence agencies have supported coups and assassinations. That is why French presidents from de Gaulle to Macron have defended the system with such ferocity. The CFA is not a favor that France does for Africa. It is a tool that France uses to stay rich. The concrete facts of the CFA system are undeniable. The reserves are held in Paris. The currency is controlled by France. The African nations have no monetary sovereignty. These are not conspiracy theories. They are written into the treaties. They are public knowledge. And yet, when African leaders or activists point this out, they are often dismissed as radicals or French bashers. The international community looks the other way. The World Bank and the IMF, which are supposed to promote economic development, have been silent about the CFA. Why? Because the system serves the interests of the global financial order. It keeps Africa weak and dependent. It ensures a steady flow of cheap resources to the developed world. The CFA is not a bug in the system of global capitalism. It is a feature. In the end, the story of the CFA Franc is a story about sovereignty. It is a reminder that political independence means nothing